Our next presenter is Ashantia, and the title of her project is At-Risk Youth, Schools, Juvenile Delinquency, and the Prison Industrial Complex. Juvenile delinquency has been a social issue for many decades. The work will apply labeling theory, theories of academic tracking and grouping, personal accounts, critical race theory, and a Marxist critique of capitalism to investigate the significant influence of the school environment on student behavior and perceptions of what is deemed criminal. Good morning.
Thank you all so much for coming out this morning. It's kind of a dreary day, but today we all get to share with you why we've been having multiple breakdowns, crying, shooting texts of just like, please help, send coffee, whatever. So my name is Ashantia, but feel free to call me Shanti. Before I get into it, I want to just sort of acknowledge the people that I have lost or have been displaced to the prison industrial complex, or who I've lost to gun violence in my personal accounts, which is where I'm drawing a lot of this work from. So I just want to state to you all that this is my honest attempt to sort of investigate the real happenings that I experienced. So again, the title of this work is At-Risk Youth, Schools, Juvenile Delinquency, and the Prison Industrial Complex. So juvenile delinquency has been a social issue for many decades. While much research has studied the deviant behavior of the adolescent, very little work has been done to study the degree to which the school environment plays into delinquent behavior. So the aim of this work is to use schools as a subject to contextualize the link between racialized criminalization and the disproportionate rate at which Black youths are in contact with the juvenile justice system. So from 2013 to 2014, juvenile arrests in Chicago stood at a very high 39,279, with 7,703 of those arrests taking place on Chicago public school grounds. So despite data suggesting that arrests have declined over the past years, Black juveniles have continued to be overrepresented and arrested at a disproportionately high rate. In 2013 alone, a total of 2,942 Black youths were arrested inside the Chicago public schools, while only 110 white youths were. And so for me, this raises the question of, are Black children inherently bad? And why is this occurring? Why is this a phenomenon that is taking place in such a dramatic way to one group of people? So, again, referring to my buttons. Okay. In 2015, a Black female high school student was violently attacked by an adult male deputy at Spring Valley High School of Columbia, South Carolina. Many of you may have seen this video. I decided not to play it as it is very triggering, and it just really brings up a lot of emotions for me. We don't need that on this very rainy day. We don't need it. So this student was asked to leave the classroom because she did not put her cell phone away. So after being asked by the teacher, an administrator was brought into the classroom to escort her out. She refused again, and that is when the deputy was brought into the classroom, who stated that either you're coming with me or I'm gonna make you. And so indeed what he did was ripped her out of her chair, which I'm sure she probably had bruises. It was a vicious attack. So back to what many of my classmates were stating about violence, that violence can take form in many ways, and oftentimes in Black communities, it takes form against them from higher institutions. So we have to keep that in mind while talking about that. So next, we're kind of going into this idea of childhood and why we have these notions that Black children are inherently bad. So discussions surrounding childhood have mostly been considered social or legal constructs. It is understood that childhood cannot be determined biologically or based on chronological age. Thus, when investigating the phenomenon of Black juvenile delinquency, its social formation must be considered. Childhood and notions of innocence have emerged as unnatural formulations throughout history as directly related to a society's mode of production. In the closing of the 18th century, a middle class began to take form, causing for children to no longer be needed in the workplace, moving them from the public sphere into the private sphere. Childhood began to be seen as a place of distance from the adult world, where adult knowledge such as sex, death, or violence was sort of like closed off to children, or synonymously the innocent. So childhood became the embodiment of innocence, and this innocence was raised white. Childhood intersects, much like age, with race, class, and gender. Oftentimes, Black children in oppressed communities are hyper-surveilled and thus overly criminalized for any behavior. I won't say their behavior, but I would say any behavior on a large scale. So kind of getting back into the personal accounts that was mentioned in the abstract that you all have. In 2007, during my 7th grade year, I transferred to a Chicago public school named Horseman, located on 80th and Jeffrey in Chicago South Side. And this was just a block off of the notorious 79th Street, or the 9 as many people know it. This strip of the East 79th Street has been for years a hub of illegal affairs, as individuals residing in this space do not have readily access to employment due to extreme clustering and other effects of segregation. And so really fast, just to break away, when speaking of segregation, topics always come up of, oh, Blacks and whites should live together, but that's not really where I'm coming from. It's not to say that Black people just want to be integrated with white communities, but it is to say that communities of color would like access to resources. They need resources, and that's what we're talking about when we want to sort of break down segregation, because those resources are also isolated from those communities. So going back in here, given that public schools are funded by local taxes, if a neighborhood has fewer businesses, then the property value of that neighborhood is lower, and thus the resources within that school become reflective of this neighborhood struggle. It just makes sense. In many of my classes at Horseman, there would be outbreaks of fights, very aggressive behavior towards other students, or even to the teachers. And a lot of times, what this behavior is sort of called is at risk. When those children are documented, it's at risk, but I would sort of argue that this is the acting of an emotional disturbance disorder. And so for a lot of emotionally disturbed disorders is sort of accompanied by aggressive behavior, outbursts, or an inability to sort of forge healthy relationships within different spaces. So specifically, I recall a moment of a classmate of mine being asked for in front of the entire class by a Chicago police officer. At the beginning of this day, the student arrived very late to class. She had blood on her, there were some scratches, her hair was all over her head, and instead of a medical therapist or an administrative counselor within the school coming to look for her and sort of process whatever happened to her before class, there was a Chicago police officer that came to pick her up. And so right here, what I was unable to articulate at the tender age of what I think I was 12 was that her behaviors were being criminalized and not medicalized. And we see that happen a lot in Black communities dealing with children of color within the school. And so sort of just going back to work through this at-risk youth, because it does say a lot. It's defined as a child who is less likely to transition successfully into adulthood. However, I argue that at-risk students, like I said earlier, are students coping with the demanding realities of their environment. This adult success is measured by achievements in academic careers, job readiness, future attainment of financial independency, and largely simply becoming a properly socialized person within a society which operates in a capitalist mode, very simply. So within critical race theory, shifting our gears a bit here, critiques of meritocracy have been discussed in that it assumes all individuals of a society have the tools to succeed at the will of their own work ethic, their drive, and their intelligence. We all know, based on the information just provided, that that's not the case. So as it relates to the labeling of students as at risk, critical race theorists have called into question the very ways in which the educational institutions use meritocracy in similar ways as the American dream ideology. Meritocracy ignores or even profits from the ways in which minority children have been pushed out of schools by the invisible hand of the institution itself and criminalized for the behaviors that would otherwise be considered acting out, given that these children were not children of color or black children. It plays on the notion of individualism to discount the processes of educational hierarchy. Meritocracy completely disregards the pre-existing inequalities of society. Understanding, let's see what other slides we got over here. A lot of them start talking. Okay. Okay. Great. Get out of here real quick. So, understanding the actions of general members of a society to be normal, according to one definition, delinquency can be defined as an antisocial behavior. Because individuals are expected to operate within normal standards, those who do not comply or fit the mode are considered delinquents, given that oppressed communities are plagued with unemployment and violence of many forms, as mentioned earlier. How then do the people inhabiting these spaces operate in ways that are considered socially normative? The way in which this work applies the term delinquency, it aligns with the definition that refers to the breaking of some law or social norm. This definition makes juvenile delinquency the committing of crimes for young people under the age of 18. So just wrapping it up with labeling theory here, labeling theory states that being labeled a deviant leads a person to engage in deviant behavior. And so what we're looking at is this sort of self-fulfilled prophecy of when we are calling these students at risk rather than sort of investigating their realities, investigating the communities that they're coming from. We are just sort of putting this very proper stigma onto them. And so I encourage everyone in this room, as I'm closing it up, thank you all so much. I encourage you all to maybe find a young folk and mentor them and get to know them and sort of carry them along the way. And for all of our works up here, this is not just to sort of fulfill a grade. A lot of us worked really hard for this, and so we want you all to take something away from this and take it out into the real world and do well with it. Thank you so much.